We're now going to talk about the next set of action operators that are supported in the observable class. If you recall, an action operator does not modify the observable, but instead just uses it for side effects. So before we looked at the doOnNext method, which was called back to kind of log or debug something. And now we're going to take a look at two other methods, doFinally and doOnComplete, that are what we call action operators. So let's start by talking about the doFinally operator. And this is actually a very useful operator. It calls the specified action after the current observable terminates. So once the whole series of events have been pushed through from publisher to the subscriber or subscribers and everything's done, the doFinally operator gets called. And you can kind of think of it a little bit like a destructor, if you will. It often plays a role similar to a destructor. The action parameter here is called when the observable signals on error or on completed, or is disposed of later, so when it goes away, basically. Action is a functional interface, similar to runnable, but it allows the throwing of a checked exception. So that's the main way it differs from a runnable, but it's very, very similar to a runnable. It's also similar to a runnable in that it's a callback that only has side effects. So it'll call things back. It's intended to have side effects, but it will not change the type or the value of the elements that are processed as it flows through the doFinally part of the code. So nothing can change. It can just have a side effect. By default, it doesn't operate on a particular scheduler. It uses whatever the current scheduling context is, which is usually obvious from the context, no pun intended. And here's a simple example. We're going to create an observable that will emit events asynchronously. We're going to then process those events on a different thread than we emit them on, and we're going to check to see if they're prime. And when we're all done with all the processing, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and display the results. So that we'll have a side effect of displaying all the results that we've been accumulating in this string buffer that's called SB. I don't show it here, but we'll see it when we take a look at the case study that's shown here in this link. So it has side effects, and in this case, it kind of behaves as a destructor for this particular observable stream that's called back when we're all done. Project Reactor has a doFinally operator on a flux that works in almost identical ways. And you can use it for all kinds of things. One thing we use here, which we'll talk about later, is to dispose of the subscriber. Assuming we made a new subscriber, which is a new thread or thread pool. This is the thread pool that has one thread in it, but it's still a thread pool. We make ourselves a new subscriber, and we use it to process the events in the background. And when we're all done, we dispose of the subscriber, kind of like having a destructor called. Remember, Java does not have destructors, unlike C++, which, of course, is a blessing and a curse. But because it doesn't have destructors, we have to have kind of these methods like doFinally to clean things up when everything's done. There's also another action operator that's worth knowing about called doOnComplete. And it returns an observable that invokes an action when the observable calls onComplete. And we'll talk a bit about how this differs from the doFinally call in just a second. So doOnComplete is called when the onComplete method is called. As with doFinally, it's passed an action, which is a functional interface that allows throwing a checked exception, but otherwise it's very much like runnable in that it just has a run method that takes no parameters and returns nothing. And again, it's called back for side effects. As with doFinally, doOnComplete can't change the type or the value of the elements that it processes. Even though a new observable instance is returned, it can't change the value or the type. Also, like with doFinally, doOnComplete does not operate by default on any particular scheduler. It's up to the context in the calling environment to decide where it's going to run. So here's an example which we'll also take a look at, where we're going to be emitting events at a particular interval. This will actually use a background thread. Emit interval will use the the interval method on observable to emit in a background thread. We check to see if something's prime. And then when everything finishes successfully, then we're going to go ahead and print the result here. Now, a somewhat obvious question to ask is, how does doOnComplete compare and contrast with doFinally? And the main difference is that doOnComplete is only going to get called when the stream, the observable stream, terminates successfully on completion. Whereas doFinally will be called sort of no matter why things are being shut down or being terminated, be it an error or a completion. Project Reactor has a doOnComplete operator that works in exactly the same sort of way. And interestingly enough, there's really nothing quite like these methods in Java streams. And kind of easy to understand why. Java streams are synchronous, and so by the time the terminal operation finishes running, then that particular stream processing sequence or chain or pipeline is done. So at that point, you could insert some code to do something at the end. With Project Reactor and RxJava, in contrast, these observables or fluxes, these chains are going to run asynchronously. And so you need a hook to do something when everything finishes running, because there's no easy syntactic place to put the code when it's done otherwise, because it's not going to continue running the next instruction after the flux or the observable stream finishes running. Whereas with Java streams, there's a good place to put that kind of behavior. OK, so that's the end of the discussion of action operators in the observable class.